Hello and most welcome to 1006, and today we will be dealing with Richard E. Nisbett's Geography of Thought. There will be a link in the description. Nisbett is famous for looking into how thinking is different in different regions of the world, and we will today look into more closely the East and compare it to the West. He has also written a whole lot of other things which I will put into the description, but we will start with chapter 7 of the book, Geography of Thought. Ce n'est pas logique, or You Got a Point, is the title. The most striking difference between the traditions at the two ends of the civilized world is in the destiny of logic. For the West, logic has been central, and the thread of transmission has never snapped. This is from philosopher Angus Graham. He also said, "It is precisely because the Chinese mind is so rational that it refuses to become rationalistic and to separate form from content." And I think you should compare this form and content to the landscape problem I mentioned in 1305. There are similarities there. Philosopher Xu Xianlu: "The aim of the Chinese classical education has always been the cultivation of the reasonable man as the model of culture. An educated man should, above all, be as a reasonable being, who is always characterized by his common sense, his love of moderation and restraint, and his hatred of abstract theories and logical extremes." That is, of course, from the world-famous Lin Yutang. To argue with logical consistency may not only be resented, but also be regarded as immature. Anthropologist Nobuhiro Nagashima. Hard as it is for the Westerner to understand, there were only two short-lived movements of little influence in the East that share the spirit of logical inquiry that has always been common in the West. These were the Mingjia and the Mohists, the latter ones followers of Mo Tzu. Both of the classical period in antiquity, The logicians, in fact, made little progress toward a formal logic, though unlike adherents of all other traditions of Chinese philosophy, they were interested in knowledge for its own sake. The Mozi tradition embraced several logical concerns. Chief among them, the ideas of necessary and sufficient conditions, and the principle of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. Nevertheless, even the Mohists stopped short of producing a rigorous system of logical inference. Moreover, despite the Mohists' advances in geometry, they never formalized it in Western fashion and never developed a set of foundational principles that would allow logical derivation of solutions. The best explanation for the Greeks' concern with logic is that they saw its utility in argumentation. So it seems to be no coincidence that Mozi both was concerned with logic and believed that argumentation was valuable for clarifying propositions and for helping to distinguish between right and wrong. Mozi wanted to develop ways of maximizing the common good, and he actually developed a rough version of cost-benefit analysis. These facts put him closer in spirit to modern Western philosophy than to either ancient Chinese or ancient Greek philosophy. Even in these aspects of his work, however, he retained an Eastern orientation like other Chinese philosophers. He made no distinction between the truth of a proposition and its morality. A position that, whatever its effects on ethics, is deadly for logic. By the first millennium AD, there were essentially no traces of a logical approach to understanding the world. Instead, there was a trust in sense impressions and common sense, and there was never, even among the logicians and mohists, a willingness to accept arguments that flew in the face of experience. Let me repeat that. They were unwilling to accept arguments that flew in the face of experience. This should be compared to Xenophanes and Xenon and modern thinking. Unlike the Greeks, who sometimes seem quite delighted to deny the evidence of the senses. As we will see, the Chinese remain far more committed to reasonableness than to reason. Logic versus experience. Integrally related to the lack of interest in logic in the East has been a distrust of decontextualization, that is, of considering the structure of an argument apart from its content. That is, of considering the structure of an argument apart from its content. Once more, compared to the landscape problem, the background, as well as a distaste for making inferences on the basis of on underlying abstract propositions alone. Two studies by Ara Norenzayan, Edward E. Smith and Byung-Jun Kim, and me show how this remains true for ordinary people in the 21st century. Consider the following two deductive arguments. Is one more convincing than the other? Question mark. 1. All birds have ulnar arteries. Therefore, all eagles have ulnar arteries. 2. All birds have ulnar arteries. Therefore, all penguins have ulnar arteries. One way to measure the extent to which people spontaneously rely on formal logic versus experiential knowledge in reasoning is to examine how they project properties. Ulnar arteries in the above example from superordinate categories, birds, to subordinaries like eagles and penguins. Notice that the two arguments have identical premises, but their conclusions vary in how typical the target bird is. Eagles are more typical birds than penguins. If you are in pure logical mood when you evaluate propositions like those above, you will supply the implicit middle premises of the argument. All eagles are birds and all penguins are birds. People who do this would find the two arguments equally convincing. But people often find arguments to a typical instance to be more convincing than arguments to atypical ones. Prior experience make them more comfortable with regarding eagles as birds than regarding penguins as birds. We asked Korean, Asian American, European American participants to evaluate the convincingness of 20 such arguments. 10 with typical targets like eagles in the conclusion and 10 with atypical targets like penguins. We found that Koreans were more convinced by typical arguments than by atypical arguments. European Americans, in contrast, were almost equally convinced by typical and atypical arguments. Asian Americans' responses were in between those of European Americans and Koreans. Consider the arguments below. which one seem to you to be logically valid? Premise 1. No police dogs are old. Premise 2. Some highly trained dogs are old. Conclusion. Some highly trained dogs are not police dogs. And then to the next. Premise 1. All things that are made from plants are good for health. Premise 2. Cigarettes are things that are made from plants. Conclusion. Cigarettes are good for health. Premise 1. No A R B. Premise 2. Some C R B. Conclusion. Some C are not A. The first argument is meaningful and has a plausible conclusion. The second argument is meaningful, but its conclusion is not plausible. The third argument, then the price of dining out will increase. Stricter health codes for restaurants will increase the cost of hiring new staff. Some of the propositions were positive. For example, more people will be able to get enough food to stay healthy. Other propositions, like the one above about the increased price of dining out, were unattractive. Noran Zayan and Kim asked participants about the probabilities they assigned to the various propositions at 2 different times. Immediately after they read each proposition and a few minutes after they had read all the propositions. Korean and American participants' beliefs showed equal consistency the first time they were tested, and the consistency of the two groups was equal and greater for both groups. The second time around for the positive propositions. But the Americans also moved more in a consistent direction for the negative propositions, and the Koreans did not. Apparently, when logical push came to desirable shove, the logical implications of some beliefs for others were less likely to affect the probability judgments of Koreans than those of Americans. Next chapter, either or versus both and. Which of the following two groups of proverbs most appeals to you? The first three or the second three? Half a loaf is better than none. All is certain to fall. For example, is no proof. Too humble is half proud. Beware of your friends, not your enemies. A man is stronger than iron and weaker than a fly. The second set of proverbs express apparent contradictions. Humble is not proud, and friends are just the sort of person you shouldn't be wary about. The first set may or may not seem very pithy, but none embody contradiction. Kai Peng and I found the second type of proverbs were more common in Chinese compendium of proverbs than in an American collection. When we asked students at the University of Michigan and at Beijing University to rate how much they liked the proverbs, we found that the Chinese students had a preference for the proverbs with contradictions, and the Americans had a preference for the proverbs without them. To make sure that it wasn't familiarity with the proverbs that was producing the differences, we conducted a study using Yiddish proverbs. We obtained similar results. Americans and Chinese were equally fond of the proverbs without contradictions, but the Chinese liked the ones containing contradictions more than did the Americans. The reasons for these differences in preference for contradiction are deep. There's a style of reasoning in Eastern thought traceable to the ancient Chinese. Which has been called dialectical, meaning that it focuses on contradictions and how to resolve them or transcend them, or find the truth of both. At the risk of doing violence to the spirit of dialecticism, which does not make use of hard and fast rules about reasoning, we can describe the three principles that are important to it, which Peng has articulated. The principle of change, the Eastern tradition of thought emphasizes the constantly changing nature of reality. The world is not static, but dynamic and changeable. Being in a given state is just a sign that the state is about to change. Because reality is in constant flux. The concepts that reflect reality are fluid and subjective rather than being fixed and objective. The principle of contradiction, because the world is constantly changing, oppositions, paradoxes, and anomalies are constantly being created. Old and new, good and bad, strong and weak, exist in everything. In fact, opposites complete each other and make each other up. Taoists see the two sides of any apparent contradiction existing in active harmony, opposed but connected and mutually controlling. So here we have a little thing to add from the book by Richard E. Nisbett. And it's the way of making conclusions that is put into the focus here. People are more likely to be correct in their judgments about the logical validity of arguments when the argument is meaningful and its conclusion is plausible. They are least likely to be correct when the argument is meaningful and its conclusion is implausible. We presented Korean and American college students with arguments that were either valid or invalid, and that had conclusions that were either plausible or implausible, and asked them to evaluate whether or not the conclusion followed logically from the premises from each argument. We examined 4 different types of syllogisms, ranging from the very simple modus ponens, which has the form, if A is the case, then B is the case. A is the case, and therefore B is the case, to the difficult structure in the 3rd example above. Both Koreans and Americans were more likely to rate syllogisms with plausible conclusions as valid. As expected, though, Koreans were more influenced by plausibility than Americans. There is no question of this difference being due to the Korean participants being less capable of performing logical operations than the American participants. Koreans and Americans made an equal number of errors on the purely abstract syllogism. The difference between the two groups would seem to be that Americans are simply more in the habit of applying logical rules to ordinary events than Koreans, and therefore more capable of ignoring the plausibility of conclusions. East Asians, then, are more likely to set logic aside in favor of typicality and plausibility of conclusions. They are also more likely to set logic aside in favor of the desirability of conclusions. William McGuire showed that when people are asked to judge the probability of events that bear a logical relation to one another. Their probability judgments move into line with one another in such a way as to increase the logical coherence. Of the beliefs taken as a whole. For example, McGuire asked people how likely they thought it was that A, that there would be a drought that summer, B, drought would mean that the beaches would be polluted because of undiluted runoff. C, if the beaches were polluted, the authorities would close them. And D, the beaches would be closed McGuire found that over time, the logical consistency among people's beliefs about the related propositions increased merely by virtue of asking them to think about the likelihood that they were true. Two weeks after making their probability estimates for a number of items like those above, the probabilities participants gave for the various propositions were more in line with logical requirements than they had been initially, before they had time to think about it. So although people did not want the beaches to be closed, after thinking about it for a while in relation to other propositions that had some significant likelihood of being true, and which implied directly or indirectly that the beaches might be closed, they became more pessimistic about their summer seaside plans. As Noren Zayan and Byom Jun Kim guessed that Asians would be less likely to have their beliefs moved in an unpleasant direction by pondering information that implied some undesired outcome. Because East Asians are not so accustomed to applying logic to everyday life events, and therefore might be able to cling successfully to beliefs that were countered by other propositions. they were asked to think about. They gave Korean and American students propositions that had a logical relation to one another, but mixed the propositions in with many others so that it was unlikely that the participants would realize that the consistency among their probability judgments were being tested. Spread out through the questionnaire, for example, were the following propositions. The price of dining out will increase. If stricter health codes for restaurants will increase, the cost of hiring new staff will as well, and then the price of dining out will increase. Stricter health codes for restaurants will increase the cost of hiring new staff. Some of the propositions were positive. For example, more poor people will be able to get enough food to stay healthy. But on the whole, the propositions were unattractive. And here we have the oddity that the East Asians had a tendency to choose the propositions that went in stride with logic. And the outcome had larger possibility of affecting the conclusions of Koreans than that of the Americans. That is indeed the principle of contradiction. And one of the words here is the Tao. I think you all heard of it. It is often depicted in the yin and yang symbol, with black and white. It is conceived as both is and is not. As the founder of the Taoist school, Lao Tzu, put it, when people of the world all knew beauty as beauty, there arises the recognition of ugliness. When they all know the good as good, there arises the recognition of evil. And so, being and non-being produce each other. Or as Mao Zedong, long-time Chinese dictator, who regarded himself as a philosopher and poet, as well as a politician and soldier, wrote, on the one hand, opposites are opposed to each other, and on the other, they are interconnected. Interpenetrating, interpermeating, and interdependent. And this character is described as identity. The principle of relationship or holism. As a result of change and opposition, nothing exists in an isolated and independent way, but is connected to a multitude of different things. To really know a thing, we had to know all its relations. Like individual musical notes embedded in a melody. The three principles of dialectical reasoning are related. Change produces contradiction, and contradiction causes change. Constant change and contradiction imply that it is meaningless to discuss the individual part without considering its relationships with other parts and prior states. The principles also imply another important tenet of Eastern thought, which is the insistence on finding the middle way between extreme propositions. There is a strong presumption that contradictions are merely apparent, and to believe that A is right and B is not wrong either. This stance is captured by the Zen Buddhist dictum that the opposites of a great truth is also true. To many Westerners, these notions may seem reasonable and even familiar. Moreover, there's a dialectical tradition of a kind that has held a place in Western thought since the time of Kant, Fichte, and Hegel. Though, in parenthesis, which is though the Hegelian or Marxist dialectic, which with its emphasis on thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, has been held to be more aggressive than the Eastern variety, because the effort is always toward obliterating the contradiction rather than accepting it or transcending it or using it to understand some state of affairs better. But Westerners tend not to be aware of the strength of their commitment to some logical principles that conflict directly with the spirit of Eastern dialecticism. These include the law of identity, which holds that a thing is itself and not some other thing, and the law of non-contradictions, which holds that a proposition can't be both true and false. The Western insistence on this pair of logical principles and the Eastern spirit of dialecticism are, on the surface at least, in direct opposition to each other. The law of identity insists on cross-situational consistency. A is A regardless of the context. The law of non-contradiction demands that the proposition and its negation cannot both be true. A and not A are impossible. The principle of holism, in contrast, indicates that a thing is different in one context than in another. And the principle of change indicates that life is a constant passing from one state of being to another, so that to be is not to be, and not to be is to be. A man is literally a different person in the family than in his role as businessman. Wealth means poverty is around the corner. Modern East Asians are, of course, perfectly well aware of the same logical principles that Westerners hold dear, and make use of logic in some context, as we have just seen. But in the East Asian view, the law of non-contradiction applies only to the realm of concepts and abstractions. The rejection of conclusions because they seem formally contradictory can be mistaken, because concepts are merely reflections on things, and it can sometimes be more sensible to admit that an apparent contradiction exists than to insist that either one state of affairs or its opposite is the true one. The differences in the two stances toward contradiction have some interesting consequences for reasoning in many domains. Peng and I asked Chinese and American graduate students at the University of Michigan to read stories about conflicts between people and about conflicts between a person's own opposed impulses. One story reported a value conflict between mothers and daughters, and another described a conflict between wanting to have fun and having to work hard in school. We asked participants to analyze these conflicts, and we coded them as to whether they were middle way, dialectical resolutions, or non-dialectical resolutions. A dialectical response usually included sentences that are attributed to the cause of the transcendence. No, to the cause of the problem, to both sides. And attempted to reconcile opposing views by compromise or transcendence. A response such as both the mothers and the daughters have failed to understand each other would have been coded as dialectical, as would an answer that pointed out that in the not too distant future it was likely that the two would come to see eye to eye. non-dialectical responses generally found exclusive fault with one side or the other. For the mother-daughter conflict, 72% of Chinese answers were scored as dialectical, and only 26% of American responses were. For the school versus fun conflict, about half the Chinese responses were dialectical, but only 12% of American responses were. In short, most of the Chinese responses tried to find a middle way. Most of the American responses demanded change solely in one direction. In another study, Peng and I examined Easterners and Westerners' preference for logical versus dialectical arguments. We asked participants which of two arguments they preferred against Aristotle's assumption that a heavier object falls to the ground first. All of the participants were graduate students in the natural sciences at the University of Michigan. But none of them were physicists. Each argument began with Aristotle believed that the heavier body is, the faster it falls to the ground. However, such an assumption might be false. The first logical argument, essentially Galileo's classical one, continued. Suppose that we have two bodies, a heavy one called H and a light one called L. Under Aristotle's assumption, H will fall faster than L. Now suppose that H and L are joined together. Now what happens? Well, L plus H is heavier than H. So by the initial assumption, it should fall faster than H alone. But in the joined body, L is lighter and will act as a brake on H. And L plus H will fall slower than H alone. Hence it follows from the initial assumption that L plus H will fall both faster and slower than h alone. Since this is absurd, the initial assumption must be false. The second holistic or dialectical argument continued. This assumption is based on a belief that the physical object is free from any influences of other contextual factors, which is impossible in reality. Suppose that we have two bodies, a heavy one called H and a light one called L. If we put two of them in two different conditions, such as H in windy weather and L in quiet weather, windy weather or quiet weather would make a difference, since these kinds of contextual influences always exists. We conclude that the initial assumption must be false. We also asked participants which of two arguments they preferred for the existence of God: a logical one or a holistic one. The logical argument was a version of the ancient cosmological one. Whatever exists must have a cause. In moving from effects to causes, therefore, in moving from effects to causes, therefore we must have two options. One is to go on tracing an infinite succession without any ultimate cause at all. The other is that we at least have recourse to some ultimate cause that is necessarily existent. But if the whole eternal chain of succession taken together is not determined or caused by anything, this is absurd. We must therefore have recourse to a being who carries the reason of his existence in him, and who cannot be supposed to exist without an express contradiction. The holistic and dialectical argument for the existence of God was the following. Just as two people watch a cup on the table, one sees a cup with a handle and the other must see a cup without a handle. If he's looking from the opposite perspective, each one of them can only see a part of the truth. Is nothing the ultimate truth? There must be a way to add up all the different perspectives, such a sum or whole consists of every idiosyncratic perspective, but reveals the truth as whole. This marvelous whole cannot be designed or found by any individual alone. We must therefore have recourse to a necessarily existent being who is above every idiosyncratic entity. A majority of Americans preferred Galileo's logical argument against Aristotle's assumption about gravity, whereas a majority of Chinese prefer the holistic dialectical argument. A majority of Americans preferred the logical argument about the existence of God over the holistic argument we concocted. Whereas a majority of Chinese preferred the holistic argument. My Western scientific colleagues find the Chinese preference for the holistic argument against Aristotle's views to be astonishing, since they regard Galileo's argument as knockdown. So I should note that only 60% of Americans preferred Galileo's argument. What would happen if Easterners and Westerners were confronted with apparently conflicting propositions? The logical approach would seem to require rejecting one of the propositions in favor of the other in order to avoid a possible contradiction. The dialectical approach would favor finding some truth in both. In search for the middle way, in order to examine this question, Peng and I asked undergraduates at the University of Michigan and Beijing University to read what we described as summaries of the results of several social science studies. There were 5 different topics altogether, and we asked participants either to read about a study reporting a particular finding, a study strongly implying something quite different, or both. The opposing studies did not necessarily contradict each other in a logical sense, but at least had the character that if one was true, then the other would seem to be quite unlikely to be true. The pair of statements below was typical of the more obviously contradictory ones. Statement A: a survey found that older inmates are more likely to be the ones who are serving long sentences because they have committed several violent crimes. The authors concluded that they should be held in prison even in the case of a prison population crisis. Statement B: a developmental psychologist studied adolescent children and asserted that those children who were less dependent on their parents and had weaker family ties were generally more mature. If it were really the case that young people who feel close to their families have more satisfying social relationships, then you would not be likely to think that it is also the case that adolescents who have weaker family ties are more mature. though admittedly this would entail no logical contradiction. Participants rated how believable the statements were. Each pair of statements was composed of one that was more plausible than the other, which we know by looking at the ratings of participants who read only one statement or the other. What inferences should the participants have made? That seems pretty clear. The participants who were exposed to two propositions that are apparently contradictory ought to have believed in each of them less than those who know about only one. This should be particularly true for less plausible propositions that are countered by more plausible ones. But neither the Americans nor the Chinese behave that way. The Chinese, who saw both propositions, reported about equal belief in both. They properly rated the more plausible proposition as less believable if they saw it contradicted than if they didn't. But the Chinese rated the less plausible proposition as more believable if they saw it contradicted than if they didn't. This and an inappropriate inference would be the consequence of feeling it necessary to find the truth in each of two contradictory propositions. The Americans, instead of converging in their belief in the two propositions, actually diverged, believing the more plausible proposition more if they saw it contradicted. Than if they didn't. This inappropriate inference would be the consequence of feeling it necessary to find the truth in each of two contradictory propositions. The Americans, instead of converging in their belief in the two propositions, actually diverged, believing the more plausible proposition more if they saw it contradicted than if they didn't. This seems the likely result of feeling it necessary to decide which of two conflicting propositions is correct. But it's pretty dubious inferential practice to believe something more if it is contradicted than if it isn't. My guess is that the Americans behave the way they did because they are good at generating counter arguments, a skill that comes from a lifetime of doing just that. When confronted with a weak argument against a proposition, they are inclined to believe they have no trouble in shooting it down. The problem is that the ease which they generate counter-argument may serve to bolster their belief in a proposition that ought to seem shakier if it is contradicted than if it is not. I'll put a short pause in here. Well, that's caused from a whole lifetime trying to find counter arguments. That is a lifeline through Western civilization. Most of mathematics and physics is coming from the law of the excluded middle, LEM. We often make conclusions from negative statements, and we know that those things can be pretty dangerous when applied too generally. The problem is the ease with which they generate counter-arguments, and they may serve to bolster their belief in a proposition that ought to seem shakier if it is contradicted than if it is not. There's evidence, in fact, that Americans do tend to generate more counter-arguments than Chinese do. In effect, Americans may not know their own strength, failing to understand how easy it is for them to attack an argument they find implausible. The American tendency to avoid contradiction seems related to the long-standing Western inclination to search for the principles that will justify beliefs. If I can show that some principle is guiding my beliefs, then I can demonstrate that any appearances to the contrary, notwithstanding my beliefs, are consistent with one another. Westerners need to demonstrate that their beliefs are guided by principles appears to apply also for actual choices. Organizational psychologists Briley, Morris, and Simpson study the consumer choices of European Americans and people from Hong Kong. All choices were among a triad of objects. Computers, for example, that differed on 2 dimensions. IBM was superior to both Sony and Apple on 1 dimension, and Apple was superior to both IBM and Sony on the other dimension. Sony was always intermediate between IBM and Apple on both dimensions. On average, across the range of choices, Americans and East Asians in a control condition were about equally likely to choose intermediate Sony. In an experimental condition, Briley and colleagues had participants give reasons for their choice, anticipating that this would prompt Americans to look for a rule that would justify a given choice, but would prompt people of Asian culture to seek a compromise. When asked to justify their choices, Americans moved from a preference of one of the extreme objects whose choice could be justified with reference to a simple rule, whereas Asian participants moved to a greater preference for the compromise object. Participants gave justifications that were consistent with their choices. Americans were more likely to give rule-based justifications, and Chinese were more likely to give compromise-based justifications. So there is ample evidence to indicate that Easterners are not concerned with contradiction in the same way that Westerners are. They have a greater preference for compromise solutions and for holistic arguments, and they are more willing to endorse both of two apparently contradictory arguments. When asked to justify their choices, they seem to move to a compromise. Middle way stance instead of referring to a dominating principle. The greater adherence to the principle of non-contradiction on the part of Americans seems to produce no guarantee against questionable inferences. On the contrary, Americans' contradiction phobia may sometimes cause them to become more extreme in their judgments under conditions in which the evidence indicates they should be less extreme. This tendency mirrors complaints about hyper-logical Western habits of mind, often expressed by philosophers and critics of both East and West. Hokum, emotion, and math one of the most reliable phenomena of social psychology is the Barnum effect, named after the circus owner who gave us the expression, "There's a sucker born every minute." If you want to make someone, anyone, think that you have remarkable insight into their character, you can tell them something like the following: although generally you have an upbeat personality, sometimes you find yourself blue without always having a clear idea why. While most people think they are reasonably outgoing, the truth is you are rather shy at the core. Most everyone thinks they are fairly upbeat, but get sad at times, that they seem sociable, but are really rather shy. What people don't realize is how common these self-perceptions are. And so they feel that the psychologists or fortune teller, as the case may be, has looked deep into their soul and found truth. Intial Choi argued that this is made easier if people do not recognize the near contradictions that are carefully built into these phony personality descriptions that lend them plausibility. Whatever the person thinks about his personality. If so, then East Asians could be expected to be more susceptible to the Barnum effect, accepting apparently opposing personality descriptions of themselves. To test this, Choi asked Koreans and Americans to rate their personalities on a number of scales. Different scales were designed to tap what most people would say are opposite traits. Choi asked participants to rate how rude they were, and in another part of the questionnaire, how polite they were. Koreans who said they were more polite than others were likely to say that they were about as rude as others. Try to make it sort of a parallel thinking here. As you can see, the landscape problem is incredibly similar. It's all about focusing on one side while ignoring the context, ignoring the background or the canvas. And as I mentioned, from the science of cognition until recently, this sharp divide between self and objects was still abundant. You can compare this to the symbol of Taoism and the landscape problem. The Newtonian paradigm would be to sort of eradicate one side and say that all the measuring should be done on this one, and no mentioning from where the measuring rods are coming from or where they are situated. As you can see, they seem to be outside of the whole. Also, in mathematics, a lot of conclusions are made by the law of the excluded middle. And this is so ingrained in us. But imagining that, for instance, an architect would say at the beginning of a construction of a house that not building it would be a disaster, and then negate that as he didn't have to do any work at all. It seemed to be a point with the middle way. It doesn't seem that being too contradictory or using inferences from contradiction as proof how the reality works could actually be dangerous, could lead us astray. The very thinking that the opposite of false is true have caused so much disaster in the world. It hides the true nature of reality. And I think in this context you need to think about fractality as well. Fractality is holism, where measurer and what is being measured is the same. Fractality unite what is outside here, the measuring rod, with what is being measured. And of course, this was very aptly put by Plato, who said an object is contained in a receptacle like an urn or an amphora of empty space, and placed in front of the subject to be gazed at. And all of a sudden we have constructed the traditional perceptual theory, and also how most people today do perceive reality, as objects are in some receptacle, or better today, the landscape or the canvas of either Newton or why not Einstein. And do remember, the landscape, the canvas, the background is from the very beginning constructed by contradiction. So the area we are working with is starting to make a contradiction, like negating something and thereby constructing nothing that becomes the canvas. It's extremely problematic, and this is one of the reasons the book The Singular Universe has 550 pages. It needs to be done slowly. Any summary or condensating would cause the problem that is tried to be avoided. And let me finish off with fractality. It goes to show that the world is much more filled with differences, peculiarities, properties, colors, flavors, all that is disappearing in this contradictory model. So the beauty of the fractality, which is actually quite astonishing, is more real as well. It makes itself more real. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.